Ever left a family gathering early just to protect your peace?
Your sister's baby shower was so special, Mom gushed across the table, her voice almost syrupy with pride, the kind of tone she reserved only for moments when she could highlight how perfect my sister's life looked compared to mine. When will we celebrate you? She asked, tilting her head with that practiced smile that had always carried just a hint of mockery underneath. I took a slow sip from my glass, more to buy myself the extra second than anything else, and then said calmly, "We did. You just never got an invitation." For the first time in a long time, her smile vanished instantly, like I had reached across the table and slapped the mask right off her face. That single sentence carried more weight than she could possibly understand, because it was not just a passing remark meant to sting. It was a carefully chosen truth that had been sitting in my chest for years, waiting for the right moment to come out. I had grown so tired of being the footnote in my own family story, the one who showed up, smiled politely, contributed quietly, but was never celebrated, never recognized, never valued beyond what I could provide. Watching her face freeze at my words, for the first time in my life, I felt like I had tipped the balance of power just slightly in my favor, and I had no intention of giving that moment back. My sister, Amanda, of course, looked shocked too, though hers was more of the wide-eyed, confused kind of reaction, the one that says she had no idea what I was even talking about because she never once bothered to ask how my life was actually going. She had been so used to being the center of every family story, the golden child, the one whose accomplishments were written into every holiday toast, and whose mistakes were brushed aside as just a phase. Amanda never questioned it because why would she? The system worked beautifully for her. It was me, the quiet background player, who was left to swallow the bitter aftertaste of years of favoritism, the kind where you learn early on that if you want validation, you better find it somewhere else because it is not coming from home. And yet here was Mom, sitting at the table acting as if the only reason I had not been celebrated was because I had not produced the kind of headline event she could parade around the neighborhood, a baby, a wedding, a new house. Something flashy that could be turned into centerpieces and party favors. What she did not realize was that I had built an entire life worth celebrating, but I had learned to do it quietly, outside her reach, with people who actually showed up for me. That little line I dropped was more than just defiance. It was a door cracking open to a truth she never expected to hear. The silence after my words stretched longer than it should have, thick enough that even Dad, who usually kept his head buried in his plate to avoid confrontation, looked up. He glanced between us like he had suddenly realized he might be standing in the middle of a storm that had been brewing for years, one he had chosen to ignore because siding with Mom was always easier than questioning her treatment of me. He cleared his throat, trying to smooth it over with something light, but the tension in the room was too sharp for even his half-hearted humor to land. For once, no one laughed, and that silence felt like justice in its own small way. I did not elaborate. That was the beauty of it. I left it hanging there, a line heavy enough to shake them, but vague enough to gnaw at their curiosity. Did I mean a birthday? Did I mean a graduation? Did I mean something even bigger? They did not know, and I was not about to hand them the answer so easily. For years, I had given them every detail, every update, every chance to clap for me, and every single time, they either turned it into a comparison against Amanda or brushed it off with a distracted, "That's nice, honey." Not this time. This time, I was going to let them sit with the discomfort of being shut out, the way I had sat with it for decades. Amanda finally broke the silence with a nervous laugh, the kind she used when she was uncomfortable, but still wanted to sound superior. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, tilting her head just like Mom had done, as if mimicking her would give her the same authority. I just looked at her, smiled faintly, and shook my head, offering nothing else. Because the truth was, it was not Amanda I wanted to get through to, it was Mom. She was the one who had made it clear, time and time again, that in her eyes, I was always less special, less important, less worthy of her gushing pride. And as much as that stung, I realized in that moment that she only had as much power as I allowed her to have, and by withholding the invitation, by withholding the recognition she thought was her right, I had taken that power back. She did not like it, not one bit, and the way her smile collapsed told me she understood that this was not just a passing remark. This was a declaration. So I sat there, calm, steady, letting the silence do the work, while inside, I felt a spark of something I had not felt in a long time: control. And if Mom thought this was the end of the conversation, she was very wrong. This was just the beginning, and she had no idea how much I had been holding back, waiting for the day when I could finally say, no, not anymore. And that day had just arrived. I did not realize how early the pattern started until I looked back and remembered all the tiny moments that felt harmless at the time, but stacked like bricks into a wall I could not see over. The award nights where I sat quietly with a certificate while Mom waved both hands for Amanda's latest spotlight. The way Dad's eyes brightened whenever she walked into a room like she was the headline and I was the footnote, and how, little by little, I learned to keep my own good news small because there was no point setting it down on a table where it would only be compared, corrected, or recast as something less impressive than whatever my sister did last week. When other kids learned that effort brought applause, I learned that applause had a gatekeeper, and that gatekeeper was a smiling woman with a soft voice who liked to say things like "we love both our girls equally," and then turn around and whisper about how sensitive I was being when I asked why Amanda got the newer phone or the surprise weekend trip, or the praise that was so effusive it made the rest of us feel like furniture. And as the years rolled forward, I got used to the way they called my interests phases while her whims became talents, so I started investing in the kind of validation that did not need to pass through their hands, which sounds brave now, but at the time, was just me trying not to feel stupid for wanting to be seen. There were the holidays that looked like family from the outside, but felt like a performance from the inside, where I cooked, paid, or fixed the mess no one else wanted to touch. And Mom would beam about how Amanda had such a delicate pregnancy glow, or such a complicated work situation, or such a busy calendar that we should all pitch in more and be grateful we could. And I did it because I thought doing the unglamorous work proved I was loyal, not realizing that in a house where loyalty is measured by sacrifice, the person who sacrifices most gets remembered least, and I became the person who quietly made everything happen while being told to quiet down about the parts of me that deserved to be celebrated. I remember a guidance counselor telling me that some families orbit around the loudest star, and that if I did not want to get burned, I should learn how to build my own sky, and I laughed because it sounded like a slogan on a poster. But I took the advice anyway, in the only way I knew how, which was to stop feeding the dynamic that kept me small by withdrawing the steady stream of details that had always made me easy to categorize and easy to dismiss, slowing the updates until they turned into polite headlines, then into vague answers, and eventually into nothing at all, because nothing is safer than something that gets used against you at the next family dinner. The strange thing is that when I stopped handing them the rope, they called it distance, not self-respect, and when I stopped celebrating milestones in their living room where every toast somehow featured my sister, they called it secrecy, not boundaries. And when I finally started building something that mattered to me with people who actually clapped when I walked into a room, Mom's first instinct was not to ask what I had created or how I felt, but to ask why she was not in charge of the guest list, as if a lifetime of ignoring me earned her the right to manage my spotlight the minute it existed. Amanda never had to learn the language of proving yourself without applause, which is not her fault, but also not my problem, and I stopped making it my problem the day I realized I was financing the illusion of family harmony with my silence. So I began a quiet experiment that nobody noticed, because I had trained them not to notice me, an experiment where I treated my wins the way they always treated my feelings, which is to say I kept them out of reach and behind a polite smile, and I watched the power shift from the person who begged to be seen to the person who decided who got to see anything at all. It started with little things that felt like tiny rebellions, but turned out to be the foundation of everything that came next. Choosing not to send the draft of a project until it was signed, choosing not to ask for advice I would not take, choosing not to sit at tables where my plate would be taken away mid-meal to make room for more praise for Amanda, and every time I withheld a piece of myself that had previously been up for public consumption, I felt a piece click back into place, not because I wanted revenge, although the satisfaction later would be undeniable, but because I wanted to stop bleeding energy into a system that had no intention of ever feeding me back. So when Mom asked her sweet, cutting question about when we would celebrate me, I had to bite back a laugh, because the answer was both simple and complicated. Simple because the celebration had already happened, and complicated because the guest list was the clearest boundary I had ever drawn. And I was not about to explain the mechanics of finally protecting my own joy to the person who taught me I needed her blessing for it, which is why I delivered the line I did and let the silence sit heavy. Since in that silence I could hear the gears turning as she tried to decide whether to be offended, curious, or strategic. What I did not say out loud, but felt like a low hum under every word, was that the celebration she had missed was not an accident or an oversight or a scheduling error. It was a decision shaped by years of being told that my good news only counted if it looked like theirs, and my decision to celebrate without them was the first real proof that I finally believed my own life did not need their choreography. And that realization changes you in a way no apology ever could, because once you feel the difference between being tolerated and being chosen, you do not go back. And while the old version of me would have softened the moment with a joke or a quick pivot to help Mom save face, the version of me that had been building a life outside their script simply took another sip, met her eyes, and held the quiet like it was a shield. Because I wanted her to understand that she had no backstage pass anymore, that if she wanted access, she would have to do something she had never actually done with me, which was to show up without entitlement and ask, and I knew she would not, because asking requires admitting there is something you do not control. The beautiful part, the part that felt like a private form of justice even before any grand reveal, was knowing that my first real act of revenge had already landed without me raising my voice or knocking over a single chair. Because I had thrown a celebration for a milestone that mattered and filled the room with people who had loved me publicly when I had nothing to parade, and I had kept the door closed to the people who only clap when the spotlight flatters them too, which meant that the next question Mom asked would not be whether I was happy, but what exactly she had been excluded from, and the answer to that would be the beginning of everything that comes next. Mom called that same evening with a kind of brittle politeness that always meant she wanted control of the conversation before it even started, asking whether my comment earlier was a joke or a mood or some kind of phase she needed to be patient about. And I let her speak until the air ran out of her sentence, because I wanted her to hear herself trying to soften what had been very clear. Then I told her that the celebration she had missed was not a test she failed and not a misunderstanding she could tidy up with a few careful words. It was a decision that made sense once you understood that I had stopped confusing blood with loyalty, and that the only people who were there were the same people who answered my late-night calls, showed up for unglamorous errands, and asked real questions about my life without turning the answers into ammunition at the next holiday table. When she demanded to know what exactly we had celebrated, I took another slow breath and said that in the space of 1 week I had signed the papers that made my company real in a way no one else could erase, closed on a home with my name on every page, and marked both milestones with a dinner where people toasted not to some future I might one day deliver, but to the work I had already done without anyone's permission. And if that sounded grand to her, it was because she had never once seen me without the filter of comparison to my sister, who could trip over a finish line and still be carried like a champion while I had been expected to smile in the background and keep the receipts. I told her that the night itself was simple because I wanted the people there to hear themselves speak more than I wanted them to watch me pose. That we went around the table and shared one thing each of them had done that actually changed something for me when I was still weak enough to keep asking her to notice me. That my mentor described watching me negotiate a contract I was supposed to accept on someone else's terms and take the cut I was being told to be grateful for, and how I asked for what I was worth without apologizing, which stunned the room not because it was cocky but because it was true. That my friend from college reminded me of the evening she sat with me on the floor while I wrote the first draft of my plan and promised that if I stuck to it she would show up for every boring, uncelebrated step until it turned into something real. And that I stood up at the end and said I finally understood that love without curiosity is just performance, and that I was done performing for people who cannot see me unless I am shining on them too. She tried to argue that family has ups and downs and that my sister's season simply required more attention, and I had to tell her that seasons do not last this long without someone choosing them. That I had measured how every room felt and how every conversation turned, and that when I stopped offering you my milestones on a plate you did not ask where I went, you only asked why you were not running the guest list. Which told me everything about why you would not be there, because you were less interested in me being happy than in me being yours to present. I could hear the shift in her breathing when she realized that my calm was not a tactic but a new baseline, that there was no version of the evening where I apologized for wanting warmth with no strings, and that the only leverage she ever really had was my eagerness to please, which had quietly disappeared the day I understood that pleasing you cost me the part of me that still believed I was worth celebrating even when you did not clap. So I told her something I knew would land the way it needed to land, which was that the celebration had been planned in the same city, on a night she could have easily made if I had invited her, and that I chose not to because I was done explaining my worth to people who benefit when I doubt it. She said that sounded cruel, and I said what sounded cruel to me was a lifetime of being told to be the bigger person while you made me smaller with a smile and a shrug. So no, this was not cruel, this was clarity. And if she wanted in on my life again, she would have to start by asking me about it without turning my answers into an assessment of how they reflect on the family brand. A phrase she hates when I use it and yet behaves as if it were real every time she stages a gathering around my sister's latest milestone, and the silence that followed told me she finally understood that I had moved the boundary from soft and negotiable to firm and enforced. I ended the call not with a fight, but with something that felt better, a clean decision that tasted like relief, sending her a single photo that showed my hand on the thick stack of closing papers with the title page visible and the pen already uncapped, along with a short note that said you asked when we would celebrate me. We already did, with the people who showed up when no one was watching, and, because I am done teaching you how to value me, you can decide whether you want to learn on your own, after which I muted her number for a few days and let the discomfort do what it never had a chance to do before, which was sit with her instead of sitting with me, and if that sounds like a small thing, it did not feel small. It felt like the first clean slice in a rope that had been around my neck for years, and it set the stage for the next move I had been ready to make long before she ever asked about celebrations at all. The thing about drawing a boundary with people who have benefited for years from you having none is that they do not notice the line until they run straight into it, which is why, after I muted Mom and gave myself a few days with actual quiet in my head, I opened a folder I had kept for far too long and started unwinding every invisible favor I had been doing to keep the family machine running, not out of spite, but because I finally understood that the machine only ran on my fuel and that I had a right to turn off the pump when the only thing I got in return was being told my tank should be endless. I began with the easy lever, the family phone plan that had somehow migrated to my corporate account years ago when Amanda's job was in a lull and Dad swore it would be temporary, a word that in our house meant permanent until I made a scene. So I called the carrier, listened to the representative read my name back 3 times to confirm ownership, and requested a scheduled split that would move their lines off my account at the end of the billing cycle with a clean handoff and no interruption. And when the agent asked whether I wanted to notify the other parties on the plan, I said I would handle it myself, because I wanted the conversation to come from me and not from a robot. Then I drafted a calm message explaining that since they preferred to treat me like a guest in my own family while enjoying the benefits of my wallet like a permanent sponsor, I would be returning their lines to their own names, and that this was not a punishment, merely a correction of a story they had been telling themselves about how things had to be. Next was the insurance bundle that had seemed efficient when I set it up because the group rate through my firm saved everyone a few dollars a month. A convenience that had turned into the weird dynamic where I fielded calls about Mom's prescription refill or Amanda's dental claims as if I were a concierge instead of a daughter. So I wrote a neat termination letter citing plan changes at work, sent it to the broker, and put an effective date that matched their open enrollment window so no one could accuse me of cruelty. Because contrary to what they said when I stopped apologizing, I was not trying to hurt anyone. I was just refusing to keep playing a role that made me resentful and them entitled. and if that role came with perks they now had to manage for themselves, well, that was the point. Then I pulled the spreadsheet that tracked all the quiet subsidies I had been carrying without applause, holiday flights I booked for them when prices jumped, deposits I floated to secure venues that somehow became Amanda's gifts from other people, utility payments I put on autopay when Dad said cash flow was tight, the baby shower balance that was covered by the family, which had in practice been covered by me with a credit card I never mentioned, and I translated every line into a clean ledger with dates, vendors, and amounts, not because I wanted reimbursement, which would have been a different kind of argument, but because I wanted the truth to finally exist outside my memory where they could treat it as hysteria. This time, the paper would carry the weight, and if they chose denial after that, it would be denial in the face of evidence, not feelings. I sent the ledger with a short note that said this is not a bill, and this is not a fight, this is clarity, and going forward I will not be covering, buffering, or smoothing out any expense that is not mine. And if that feels abrupt, I invite you to look at the dates and ask yourselves how long abrupt actually lasted. Then I put the phone down and let the quiet stretch, because I knew the calls would come and I wanted to meet them with the calm I had earned rather than the anger I had been trained to weaponize against myself. Mom called first, of course, with the wounded voice that had always been my cue to fix the story so she would not have to sit in it, insisting that family does not keep score and that money is not love, and I told her I agreed completely. Which is why I was removing money from a place where love had always been conditional, and that if she wanted to talk about love we could, but if she wanted to talk about access to my benefits, the answer was simple and already in motion, and when she pivoted to the baby again and asked how I could do this when Amanda was expecting, I said gently that Amanda has a partner, a household, and an entire network of people she will happily let manage her life, and that I had finally chosen to stop being the unpaid manager whose reward for efficiency was being called distant when I asked for respect. Amanda texted a long paragraph about how I was making everything about me during her big season, and how she would have gladly celebrated my wins if I had told her, and I typed back a single, even sentence that said I tried that for years and you called it drama, so I built something without you, and because you were not there when it was fragile, you do not get to claim it now that it is solid. After which she tried the group chat approach with cousins and an aunt who still thinks I am the picky one, at which point I posted the ledger without commentary, muted the thread, and felt a calm I did not recognize settle in my chest like a chair finally pulled out for me at my own table. What I did not include in the ledger, the thing I kept for last because it mattered most, was a separate account I had opened years ago when I still believed that giving generously would eventually be seen for what it was. An education fund in my name and under my control that I had intended as a surprise for the first child in the family who would need it. A tidy nest that had grown quietly with every deposit I made after another dinner spent listening to how Amanda's future children would be adored and supported, and as Mom begged me to reconsider the phone plan and the insurance and the petty ledger. I looked at the balance on that account and realized the most honest thing I could do was stop pretending it belonged to a story that never included me, which is why I moved my cursor to the line that begins beneficiary and prepared to make a change I knew would crack the last illusion they held about where my loyalty lives. I sat with the cursor blinking on the beneficiary line and felt, not rage or triumph, but the steadiness that comes when you finally act like the person you have been becoming for years. So I entered the new designation, named the fund for what it truly represented rather than for the family who had mistaken my generosity for an obligation, appointed an independent trustee through my firm so that no tearful phone call could unwind it, signed the documents that hardened the decision into something no group chat could undo, and watched the confirmation arrive with the kind of quiet I used to beg for and now owned. I did not send an announcement because I had learned what announcements become in my family, so I drafted one simple message that said the support structures I built are now aligned with the people who actually supported me, that the logistics you relied on are returning to your own hands, and that the education fund you assumed belonged to your future plans has been reframed to serve the kind of kid I used to be, the one who does everything right and still hears she is somehow less. After which I turned off the screen, took a breath, and waited for the inevitable attempt to make my boundary sound like a betrayal. Mom did not disappoint, calling with a voice so soft it could have been mistaken for love if I had not cataloged how often it arrived only when something was at risk, asking how I could take opportunity from a child who had not even been born yet. And I told her, evenly and without apology, that I had not taken opportunity from anyone. I had refused to let my work be owned by a story that never included me, and that the fund now bears my name because I am the one who built it, is administered independently because I am done refereeing family emotions, and will pay out first to a student whose recommendation letter described being the quiet kid who tutors everyone else while saving lunch money, which is to say the kind of invisible labor that made me in this house and nearly broke me in it too. She said that sounded vindictive, and I told her it sounded like focus, because for years I was told to be the bigger person while being made smaller in the process. So I chose a path that grows something instead of performing a forgiveness no one earned. And if she wanted to call that cold, then she would have to say it slowly while looking at a line item ledger that showed how many holidays I quietly funded and how many emergencies I quietly solved, because cold is not the word for a woman who has kept a family warm while being told to stop asking for a seat by the fire. Amanda texted in paragraphs, insisting that I was punishing her child for dynamics between adults, and I wrote back one long sentence that I read out loud to make sure it held, telling her that children are not punished by adults setting boundaries for other adults, that her partner and her household are fully capable of building their own future the same way I built mine when no one offered to hold a brick, and that the easiest thing she can do for her baby is to learn the difference between entitlement and love before the baby learns it from watching us. Then I sent the only picture that mattered, not a party or a toast or a ribbon, but a copy of the trust confirmation next to a short list of conditions I would require before any version of us tried the word family again, which were not punishments or hoops, but the basics of a relationship I could stand to be in. No more comparisons dressed up as jokes, no more group ambushes when I say no. A standing agreement that if anyone wants help they ask directly without guilt or theater, and a commitment to one session a month with a neutral counselor for as long as it takes to break the habit of making me the villain when I stop financing the play. Dad, who had been mostly silent for days, called with his careful tone and asked if there was anything he could do to fix this quickly, and I said the only fast thing left to do was to stop looking for shortcuts through the feelings you avoided for years. That if he wanted a relationship with me, it would be built on curiosity rather than convenience, and that I would not confuse his discomfort with urgency anymore, after which he said he understood, and for the first time in a long time I believed him, not because he promised anything, but because he did not ask me to make it easier for him. I did something then that would have looked petty if I had done it earlier, but at this point read only as clear. I mailed Mom a single sealed envelope with a copy of the dinner invitation from my celebration and a handwritten note that said you were not excluded because I hate you. You were excluded because I love myself enough to refuse a tradition where my joy is a prop, and if you ever want to sit at a table where my life is not the appetizer for your pride in my sister, you will have to arrive without the script, which I know you can do because I have seen you be generous when you are not afraid. The first scholarship disbursement posted the following week to a girl whose guidance counselor wrote that she never once raised her voice, but somehow kept half the school afloat. And I forwarded that single line to Mom with a final message that said this is where the money went, this is what it does, and this is how I will measure family from now on. By who adds weight to my life when I am carrying something heavy and who stops piling more on when I say I am at my limit, and then I silenced the thread and went to work because the best part of this plan was never the shock, it was the freedom. Weeks later, when I finally answered a call from Mom, her voice did not reach for the script, and she asked, slowly, if we could talk without keeping score, and I said we could try. That trying did not require access to my accounts or to my plans or to my calendar. It required telling the truth without turning it into a family brand statement, and she said she could do that, which I suppose we will both discover together. But that was not the victory, because the win had already been banked the day I realized I was not auditioning anymore. People love to ask whether I went too far, whether I regret the ledger or the split or the scholarship, and I tell them that the only thing I regret is all the time I spent explaining myself to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. Because the plan was never about punishment, it was about taking my life off their stage and putting it on its own feet, and if the price of that is being called cold by the same people who left me out in the name of tradition, then I can live with that. Since for the first time in years I am living with myself.